Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest of our FrenchEntrée webinars. My name is Zoë Smith. I'm digital editor of FrenchEntrée, and I'm joined today by Richard Hammond from French Connections HCB and Fabien Pellissier from Fab French Insurance. Today's webinar is the first in our Moving to France series, and we'll be focusing on the first step in that journey, which is applying for your long stay visa. Going to be looking at some of the different visa types, the visa application process, and the health insurance requirements for your first year in France and beyond. So if you're a non-EU citizen looking to move to France or retire to France, then this webinar is for you. Before we get started today, we are recording today's webinar, and it will be available to stream for free over on our FrenchEntrée YouTube channel. Do go and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss out, and we'll pop the link for you in the chat box right now. We're also streaming live to Facebook today, so welcome to anyone who's watching us over there. For those of you that aren't familiar with FrenchEntrée, we are part of the France Media Group, who are specialist publishers covering all aspects of French life and culture, from travel to gastronomy to buying property. FrenchEntrée itself has been a leading resource for French property buyers for 20 years now. In fact, 2023 is our 20th anniversary. And not only do we help buyers to find their dream property in France, we also help and advise with every aspect of the property buying and moving to France journey. Now, if you are looking to buy a property in France, you might also be interested in our French Property News magazine, which you can subscribe to over on the FrenchEntrée website. And you can also buy our full range of magazines, calendars, gift cards, and lots more at francemedia.shop. Right, so let's jump into today's long stay visa applications and health insurance webinar. As I mentioned today, I'm joined by Richard, owner and managing director of French Connections HCB, who are bilingual relocation specialists and experts in French visa and residency applications. I'm also joined by Fabien, founder and managing director of Fab French Insurance, who are independent insurance brokers offering bilingual services, and most importantly, health insurance policies that meet the requirements for French long stay visas. Fabien and Richard, if I could please ask you both to turn your cameras on now and come and join me. There they are. Hello, Richard. Hi, Fab. Thank you to both of you for joining us today, and thank you to everyone who sent your questions in today. We're going to be aiming for a runtime of around 90 minutes today, and I'm going to put as many of your most frequently asked questions as possible to Richard and Fabien. If you have any questions as you go along, you can put them in the Q&A box on your screen at any time. And if you're watching this on Facebook, you can also leave a comment and one of my colleagues will pick that up. We'll also be conducting a couple of quick polls throughout just to make sure that you're all still paying attention. And finally, if we don't get around to your question today, or your question is too complicated to address in this webinar, we are going to send out a contact form to all of you after the webinar so you can get in touch with both of our experts directly. We'll also drop the links to that into the chat box for you right now. And if you do want to get in touch with them, do make sure you use the links that we send you, as they've also put together a special discount for anyone watching this webinar. Quick disclaimer before we get started. It is important to remember that all visa applications are considered on an individual basis by the French Immigration Department, so there are no guarantees that your visa application will be approved. However, the point of this webinar is to help you understand the rules, the application process, and the eligibility criteria to maximize your chances of getting the French visa that you need. And if you do want the peace of mind of having an expert like Richard or Fabien handle your visa application or your health insurance policy, then you can use that contact form that I just mentioned to get in touch with them. Right, well, that's more than enough from me, so let's get started. We're going to start with Richard today and looking at applying for your long stay visa. So I'll start by asking Richard to just introduce himself and tell us a little bit about French Connections HCB and what services you provide.
Yeah, thank you, Zoe. So yeah, my name's Richard. I'm the MD of French Connections HCB, but also HCB Services based in the UK. I created the business 4 years ago now. It was actually an idea that I had when I was 18. I think it's fair to say that although it don't sound like it, I am actually a French national and French-born individual, but from British parents. So from a very young age, I identified the need that people would need help in France, and I started off with my parents to start off with. And like many startups, I guess, when I first had the idea at 18, people told me it was a bad idea. And now here we are, quite a few years later. I'm now 35 years old, but after working both in the USA and in the UK, I chose to move back to France 5 years ago personally, and identified the need very early on in my stage of running and developing my business. Fabien contacted me, and yeah, it's been another long-lasting story since then between us, because we've really evolved our business based on the needs of clients. And initially, we actually only worked in our area, and we've grown to all of France. We now cover all of France, all of Italy, and we have about 20 members of staff working for us. Since Brexit, that's presented a few challenges, and we've actually also got offices in the UK to employ people that are working from the UK. So yeah, today we are partners, I guess, with everybody that is reliable and dependable on the French assistance marketplace. And of course, our major partner is Fabien, because our both businesses are interlinked, whether it be for today the visas, but also car and home insurance, which we kind of delve into all of the other services that people didn't really want to do before. And yeah, we've developed that over the last 4 years, and yeah, I think we're doing a pretty good job given the comments that we get from our clients.
Brilliant. Thanks, Richard. Right, we're going to jump straight into some questions. I will just quickly, I saw a few people asking the same question straight off the bat. Yes, the stuff that we're going to talk about today, it isn't just for British residents, it is for residents of all other non-EU countries.
Absolutely.
Right, so let's jump into some of the most frequently asked questions. Let's start with a simple one, if there are any simple visa questions. Can you briefly explain the process for someone looking to move to France?
Yeah, I guess, and just to clarify as well, the good news with us is that a majority of our clients are actually from the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, not from the UK. Mainly because, to mention that, is because this status and these visa requirements that we're talking about today in urgency, shall we say, because there's more and more requests coming in, I guess, than ever before. The good news is, well, Fabien and I have been doing this for years now, because this hasn't changed, if you like, for the majority of people. It's only for British people that they now have the same treatment as a US or Canadian or Australian or from anywhere else in the world. So when you're moving to France, of course, well, the main thing is to find out what you're going to want to do in France. Are you just moving there to extend a holiday? Are you there to discover? Are you there to study? Are you there to work? Right. So depending on the answer to those questions, and if it's a bit of everyone, and quite often we have clients there, then it's identifying, of course, where you're going to want to live. Are you going to be buying a house? Are you going to be renting? And then looking into the legalities of things. So, of course, the visas are going to be required for the majority of your cases. I mean, sometimes if you just want to go on holiday, a 90-day will be fine. You don't need to do anything. You can just travel to France. But if you suddenly change your mind, and it happens very often that we have people that are from the US, for instance, that decide, look, we want to stay in France. We came on holiday. We found a house we want to buy here. Unfortunately, everything starts with the visa. So you can't just stay in France. We also have a lot of questions from people that have EU spouses. So, i.e. an American's married to a French person in France, they came on holiday, they're going to stay there. Well, no, actually, you're going to have to go back to the US to start your process. So everything starts with a visa from an admin point of view. And then consider, of course, all of the other things. So health insurance for the part that Fabien pays, but then can be replaced by state coverage. And then, of course, getting your affairs in order from a tax point of view, and just from general admin, driving license exchanges, potentially all of the things that are not very sexy, I guess, to think about when you're moving. It's not the chateau, but in that context, yeah, you've got to consider those things. So I think first consider what you're going to move when you move to France. What's the aim, and then visa, step number 2, and then go from there, really, from the admin trail. But a company like ours kind of steps in at any stage to help you.
Great. Okay, so that's a good place to start. Whatever your situation, you probably will need a visa to start with, and you will need to apply for that in your home country before you arrive in France.
Sure.
Okay, so what's the difference between a long stay visa or what we often refer to as a temporary long stay visa, or a sort of 6-month visa?
So, I mean, it's a difficult question to answer in a very short amount of time in an awful lot of detail, but I think what your viewers today will be interested in is really what happens after the visa in the context of that. So a 6-month visa is just not going to be good enough to be able to renew in France to move on to a carte de séjour, which is what some people refer to as residency, although it's not really residency, it's something a little bit different. But in any case, if you want to stay in France long term, you're going to have to start with a visa if you're coming from outside of the EU, that is, of course. If not, you're lucky. But if you come from outside the EU, so that considers anyone in that context, and you want to stay in France, you're going to have to start with a long stay visa. Whether that then be a working or non-working one is another question. But the short-term visa, other than having an advantage in terms of the policies that are potentially allowed to have in terms of health coverage, shows no real advantage. And I'd either go to argue that if somebody's just coming on a holiday, an extended holiday for 6 months, you might just want to apply for a 12-month one anyway, just to have that flexibility, because in itself it's not much different to apply for.
Okay, right, that's interesting. Okay, so talking about this long stay visa, the 12-month visa, so that's the first step for people moving to France. Sure. How does somebody go about applying for a long stay visa? What's the process?
Yeah, so quite simply, that again, this is just to simplify to a maximum, right? There's going to be 3 criteria that you need to have to apply for these visas, which is, and in layman's terms, it's like really simplify it to what the French government want to make sure that you have, which is somewhere safe to live in the form of a 12-month rental contract, which is an official rental contract, not just somebody saying you can stay at my house, or a proof of deeds, a proof of purchase of a property. Health coverage, and again, this is more Fabien's area, and he can probably go into detail what can be accepted or not. And I think with everything here, as you mentioned in your disclaimer, it is to the discretion of the person that's actually going through it. So the point of having a legal firm in which we work with in terms of these kind of applications is to make sure that before your file goes in front of the relevant body, everything's been checked. But still, there's always a human element, and whoever's checking and whatever law and change can happen, and depending on which country and how tough the issues are in the consulate at that stage. But in that context, health insurance. So there's several policies that are available. Fabien, being a broker, will be able to provide with all of the kind of options that he knows can work. And in terms of course, somebody retiring, then if they're from the UK, there's some allowances. But I mean, in general, you need this healthcare, this private medical healthcare, which just means that if something happens to you, the French government know that you've got your own back covered, essentially, right? And travel insurance doesn't count, unfortunately, guys. And in terms of the third element, well, it's
cutting out a little bit there, Richard.
They want to make sure, and when I say they, the French government want to make sure that you're going to. I cut out, didn't I? Sorry. So yeah, the French government will want you to make sure that you're going to. Funds. Yeah, absolutely. So 1,330 euros times 12. And you know, lots of people are stressed about this element and contact us and say, how can I don't work anymore, I'm retired, I've got stocks and I've got passive income, etc. Well, I mean, please don't stress overly about this point. The main thing is that you can show in an account, ideally if it's in your name, the current account, that amount times 12, that works. You know, so you don't need to go overboard with, you know, proof of income, etc. Although the more you have, the more you can prove, of course, the safer the request is, if you like. So we always advise people to have a little bit more than the minimum in their accounts. And when it's, for instance, families applying for, I had the case this morning where I've got a family buying a house and they've got a multiple situation, and some of them are going to be working in the future and some of them are not. But in that context, if there's an allowance with the family that you can transfer money into each of their accounts to have that minimum amount, that works fine. So those are the main criteria: making sure you're safe, got somewhere to live, that you've got proficient healthcare, which Fabian, of course, can help you with, and make sure that those policies are subject to what we know are applicable. And of course, in terms of income, that you either have proof of a saving of that amount or an income source in the form of a pay slip or something along those lines, right?
Great. And yeah, I think that'd be quite reassuring to people as well, particularly regarding the sufficient funds. I get a lot of questions about that. Okay, what about specific documents? What kind of documents would you need to supply during the long stay visa application?
Well, again, it's difficult to do this, over a few minutes, but the documents themselves are going to have to be relative to the 3 points, right? So rental contract, a bona fide French 12-month rental contract. So I'm a private landlord myself and a commercial landlord, and the rules in France around rental contracts are very firm. So it's not an Airbnb contract. It's not a booking.com for 6 months. That will not be accepted. But of course, you need to make sure that you've got a document around that. And a lot of our clients, for instance, want to try before they buy. So, and I guess then it comes to this question where, well, I can't stay there unless I've got a visa, and how do I go back getting a visa? So getting a rental contract, bona fide rental contract, is one option. There's a few ways around that. If people have got questions, and please, feel free to contact me, because we can also assist by, if you're buying a house from somebody and you need help getting a contract from them potentially to rent it, that could work. In terms of the proof of funds, well, yeah, I mean, bank statements, pay slips, pension payments, etc., proof of anything that's got your name, address on it, essentially, that's dated. And in terms of health insurance, then, yeah, again, this is going to be Fabian's remit. Fabian's website is extremely well built in the concept that he will give you all of the things that are equipped for, accepted for, the historical acceptance rate on an actual document. And it is really, really worthwhile making sure, if you're not using our services, or in terms of pre-booking your appointment, making sure that those documents are correct, because, as I'm sure Fabian will tell you, then it's just a refusal, and it's an easy one to refuse on. So the health coverage is it's such a grey area of what can be accepted or not, that it's just that, if they don't want to issue the visa, it's a great one to move you back on. Same as proof of funds for a family, right? So if you don't have the right documents or the right rental contract, even though that it kind of is going to work that way, and maybe you're not even going to stay there for 12 months, but initially you've got to prove the things, and in a very Frenchly way, and you've got to have the things that tick the boxes. There's no grey.
That's a very good point to tell people that aren't aware and don't have experience of French administration. They can be very, very, very picky on things, and you do need, if they ask for a specific form, it does need to be that specific form and that specific word.
And this is being subcontracted, Zoe, from to a company for the French government. So that company is responsible, and in a way, the more they send you back, and probably works out better for them, because it's more applications for them to deal with. I hate to say it, but probably true. So you've just got to consider that before you go and send and launch and book. And I think there's so many variants as well that it's very confusing for somebody doing it online in general.
And what about passports? Because they do take your passport during the process. Is that correct?
Well, this is all going to depend on how quickly the consulate will deal with it. In the UK, historically, it's very quick. I mean, places like New York, San Francisco, for instance, or Sydney, can be extremely fast, but can be extremely slow. So expect to have your passport held for 2 to 3 weeks, and I would say a month really at the maximum. But again, if you use a company like ourselves, we coach you through all of this. Our actual barrister, or avocat pour le Paris, will call you, coach you through the appointment, make sure that you understand exactly what's going to happen. If you're a business person, more importantly, and this is often what happens to me, is that if somebody's got their own company and actually is going to work as a digital nomad in Paris for the next 8 months, he can't maybe afford to lose his passport for 2 weeks or 3 weeks because he's got to go to Delhi or he's got to go somewhere else. So the more warning in advance you have, you can kind of plan around that. But I would say typically those documents are going to have to be taken, and then just your general kind of suspects, proof of ID, proof of current address, etc. As for any government application, I would like to say.
Yeah, great. And in terms of the application process then, so the beginning of the process starts online, is that correct? And then how long would you wait until you get an appointment at the visa office? What's the sort of timeline on that?
Sure, and again, extremely variable based on who you apply or which country you're applying from. Yes, there is an online platform. It's slightly confusing. I've got a lot of clients that come to us afterwards because they've tried themselves, they've got so far, and actually they'll end up wanting us to do it. So from our part, client actually only comes online to see us. We then do everything for them, and we prepare them for the form, for the actual appointment itself. But essentially, in very simple terms, you book online, you go to your appointment with your documents, they take your passports, you wait for the actual documents to be issued, and then you've got to go to France within 3 months of that visa being issued to validate it and stamp it in France. A question that's probably going to follow from this, and sorry if I'm stealing your thunder, is like, how can you delay this visa from being applied? Except yes, you can, and Fabian can also delay the insurance start dates, etc. We can, so there is some flexibility in that, but I would say for somebody that wants to move to France now, well, plan 3 months at least ahead to get your visas, because a rough period of 3 months on average, depending on the country, is probably fair to say that's the quickest you'll be able to get that an application through. But in emergency cases, because we deal with so many visa applications, I think over 3,500 confused between renewals and new applications last year for us, we actually have pre-booked appointments as well. So, if there's really a last minute one, we might be able to get it through. But as always, it's subject to, the person that's got the documents and how quickly we can get the right stuff, because we won't send anything if it's not perfect, essentially. And we won't send the client if it's not going to be for an approval.
Right.
Really.
Okay, that gives people a good idea of how to plan ahead. Right, let's have a look at what some of the different types of visa are available. So what are some of the different types of long stay visas available, and how would I choose which one is right for me?
So I think let's talk about a hot topic, which is digital nomads, right? So and over the years of doing this for people, we kind of have, I guess, two categories, and the latter one actually becoming more popular these days. So an awful lot of our clients, even before Brexit, were probably people retiring to France or owning second homes. Yeah, and today a vast majority are actually people that are able to work remotely. So this has presented a whole new kind of challenge in the world in general. Of course, how do you legalize all of this? The good news is, for anyone that has got a digital nomad job, you can work on a long stay, regular 12-month BLS visa. The rules are simply.
Sorry to clarify, is that the visitor visa?
Yeah, absolutely. So the visitor visa. So you can work and continue to work from home, but there are rules around taxation. That's another thing, how long you stay in the country, etc. But in terms of working, you're allowed to work as long as the company does not have any economical interest in France. So i.e., if you're not there to prospect business, and if you are not there to actually be working for a regional office, then you can work from home, right? So that's absolutely fine. You continue paying taxes in your own country, social care in your own country, but you're going to have to tick the boxes of private medical care, having somewhere to live, and obviously being able to prove income. And after you've spent 183 days in the country, guess what? You've got to become a taxpayer. So the good news for most countries that we deal with is bilateral tax agreements. So if you pay tax in one country, you won't have to pay it again in France. So a lot of our cases are actually covered by the long stay 12 month. Another topic that's often of the case, I think it's too much Dick and Angel and escape to the chateau syndrome. People wanting to open sheets, and we've actually often had the case that legal advisors have said you must definitely have a work visa or talent passport visa and pay loads of money to actually get hold of that. The truth is there's several setups in France that allow you potentially to rent a home or place in France without having to register as a business necessarily. So a loueur meublé non professionnel, there's lots of laws and regulations. We don't have time to go through those today. And of course, contact me if you do want to talk more about it. But the point being is that there are some key options where you don't need to do that, even if you're going to be a gîte owner. And secondly, having a construction firm myself and renovating houses, are you going to be ready within 12 months? I'm not sure. So if you're going to buy a chateau and actually you're not going to necessarily be, unless you're buying a business and you're going to be working straight away. But my point being is that quite often you're not going to be working within those first 12 months. And there's an interesting argument to say that actually what you could do is come in on a long stay visa, and after 10 months, apply for a change of status on your carte de séjour. That's something that we very often do, that we do very successfully. And by that stage, if you have a home, etc., you're already on the social system in terms of healthcare. You could have saved an awful lot of money in legal fees and setup fees. And as a business owner in France, you've also saved a year's worth of accountancy fees, which are very high compared to the US or to the UK, notably for countries that I know. So that long stay visa is very versatile, and it also, of course, includes people that are retiring. You don't want to work. If you're retiring, you don't need to worry about a work visa or talent passport. And then the other two, I guess, talent passport. There's so many intricate things to comply with that I wouldn't have time to go through all of them today. But you could be an entrepreneur. And if you are an entrepreneur, there's a certain amount of money that you have to bring to that. You could be a sports person, you could be a student. There's all of these things, but mainly what that does is it just allows you to have a longer term on that visa, so of 4 years in total. But the same kind of criteria as the first three things that we said were important apply. So you need to contact FAM for your insurance, you need to make sure that you're going to be able to sustain your needs and have somewhere safe to live. And finally, the work visa, which I would tend to say is really mainly discussed in few cases is it actually really applicable, because either it's your employer's responsibility because they're changing your place of work and they need to provide you with a contract in that country and they need to pay for your visa. That would be their responsibility. Very few of them obviously want to do that, but if they did, that's their responsibility and they should pay for that. And it's just more complex in terms of application. So guess what? A legal advisor will charge you more money to do that. But if you are creating your own business, and if that's a yoga retreat or a gîte, etc., 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 my guess is you're not going to be able to be running it within the first 12 months. And so my advice through hundreds of applications is probably, if that's not a necessity, I'd argue that if it's going to be a necessity to make money within the first 12 months, you might want to reconsider the business project that you have. But in all context, really, the long stay with a change of status at the end probably would work better. So those are the three main differences, if you like. The criteria for application are very similar, but of course, in the talent passport one, there's so many different variants that you really need to speak to a barrister to be able to make sure that that would work for you. But very often, the sort of answer to all is the long stay.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting, especially for the business visas, because I think that's something a lot of people do not know, that that's a possibility to come on a visitor visa and then change it. So that could be a really good option for some people.
Yeah, and there are criterias, and obviously the French prefecture have got a mind of their own, so you've got to be careful. And when I say they have a mind of their own, it is also the case that, for instance, on the renewal, you need to have or a private medical cover or a carte vitale, which is the equivalent of a French healthcare system application, or numéro de sécurité sociale. Recently, we've had one prefecture that said you can't have it on private medical cover, which is completely untrue, if you like, but you can take them to court. So, you know, you've got to be conscious that all of this theory and loads of successful applications can also result in difficulties, and that's when it's good to have somebody help you through that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I can see why it would be invaluable to have someone like you guys on the case for them. Okay, one more question, and then we'll have a little look at some of the live questions. We did touch on this slightly earlier, but do I need a visa to join my French or EU spouse in France?
Yes, you do.
I think that's something that confuses a lot of people. So is that something they'd have to apply for?
So there are some statuses where you kind of, again, it would just make it an awful lot easier to apply for this long stay visa in terms of time to process. And I give the real life example, you know, I was born in France. I never took French nationality. Fabien's going to boo me now, but I never did because it was before Brexit. Why bother? You know, it wasn't really even a thing for me. So I went through my whole life on a UK passport until Brexit happened, and I quickly rushed to get my French passport. And it took me a year. And then when it was delivered, I think, you know, I've already told you guys, when it delivered to me, they said, oh, this could have been done in half the time. And I'm like, well, why didn't you tell me? And it's just, that's just the way things are. So yes, there are ways around the especially if you've got a French wife or French partner, but in reality, it's just going to be a lot quicker, a lot more comfortable for you to just go on a long stay and then do your change and amendments. Contact us, of course, if you want advice on that, because we've got these cases up constant. A lot of our clients are from the US, and a lot of US citizens have actually got European roots, whether it be in Italy or in France. So yeah, it's something that happens quite often, but usually the long stay is the answer to all.
Okay, that's good advice. Well, thank you, Richard. Right, I'm gonna put a quick little poll up on the screen. I'll give Richard a little breather for a minute. Let's put the first one of these up. So should be able to see that on your screen now. So what best describes your situation? I want to retire to France. I want to move to France to work. I want to set up a business in France. I want to join my EU spouse or family member in France. I'm a second homeowner wanting to spend extra time in France, so not looking to actually move and be resident in France. Or perhaps you just want to move to France one day and you're just here to get a bit of information. I'll give you a little bit more time to answer that. Looks like you're answering pretty quickly. Now I'll start having a quick look at some of these live questions that we're going to put to Richard, and then let's see. Okay. Okay, looks like most of you have answered, so I'm going to end that poll and share the results with you on the screen. So quite overwhelmingly, people wanting to retire to France, although we do have a few second homeowners and a few people looking to set up a business as well. Interesting. Okay, thank you for taking part in that. I'm going to stop sharing that now, and I'm going to have a quick look at some of the live questions for Richard. Okay, let's have a look. Quick one here from David. It says, when applying for the second year of a long stay visa, so I'm assuming it actually means a carte de séjour at that phase, yes, do you have to submit a copy of your birth certificate in French?
Yes, you will have to. Well, in terms of the gathering documents, not necessarily in French, but they can request it. Again, it's just
sorry, you cutting out there.
It has to be a sworn translated document.
Just
sorry.
Cut out at the important bit to keep us all in suspense.
Okay, sorry about that. But yeah, so you do potentially have to have the translated copy. You don't necessarily have to. It's the prefecture will decide. And if it is a translated copy, it must be a sworn translator that's actually issued the document. Okay, great. Yeah, that's interesting actually, that it does seem to depend on which prefecture is handling
application. And I think that that's a good thing to point out, because I do get a lot of people writing in saying, well, I heard so-and-so said this, so why am I being asked for this? But I'm assuming if you are asked for it, you're going to need to submit it.
Again, it's not one rule that fits every prefecture. We had the case, as I said recently, where you're not, they refused a French private cover, not in the rule book, but they kind of do what they want.
Okay, right. Let me have a look. Okay, we're a married couple who are going through the visa process and waiting to go to a single booked interview. Should we have booked 2 interviews? I'm assuming these are people who've applied online. So
you should have 1 per person.
Okay.
So other than one that I don't know about, but yeah, you should have 1 per person. It's possible it's exactly on the same day and one is after the other, but usually it's 1 applicant, especially during COVID. Of course, all of this was applicable, 1 person at a time. And you're not allowed mobile phones in there either, guys. So no cheat questions.
Oh, okay, that's a good one to know. So following on from that, if you are a couple applying, can you do the application together, or do you have to apply as 2 complete?
No, it's a single. It's two different things. Yeah.
Okay, that's probably a good thing to point out. A few questions about taxes and things, which we're not covering in this webinar. Do you have to?
I can answer questions about taxes, guys. Just contact me outside of this.
Okay, there we go. I previously had a long stay visa here. I'm not sure what that's about. Sorry, just trying to field some can you just can you just have proof of accommodation? Do you really need a 12-month rental agreement? Yeah. There's no way around.
You can try, but and again,
you won't get it. Okay.
The odd person might get through with like a letter from my mate, that says you can stay in the back bedroom, but if you want a successful application, you need to make sure that there's certain documents, and in France in general, you'll find that when you do get here, that it's just it's a black or white box. There's nothing in between.
Okay. Digital nomad visas, we've already answered that. Sorry, so many of you have asked questions, so it's taken me a little while to go through them. Okay. Do the documents need to be written in French? Yeah, do documents need to be translated into French for the long stay visa application? So when you're applying from your home country?
So it depends. It will depend on which document, marriage, birth certificates, things like that. Depending on the country, they might accept, they might not accept. Sworn translations need to be provided if they are requested. These are things that won't cost you a fortune, though, guys. So, like, if they want a birth certificate translated, it's usually a cost per word. Something like that. We provide that service as well, but it's probably a 2, 3, 4 day turnaround. So don't ever panic too much if they suddenly turn around and say we need that document translated into French. But again, it depends on the application network, etc. All of these are subcontracted, so it depends how the guy or the lady that's doing your file will potentially request it or not.
Okay. Somebody also saying, I was divorced before and have since remarried. Will I need to have a copy of the divorce certificate and the marriage certificate? Yeah, okay. So it'll be pretty much your whole history in terms of...
Especially if you've got any other aliases or things like that in terms of your application. Sure. Okay,
good to know. Are there language skill requirements? Are there any language requirements?
And this is a good question, because a lot of people confuse residency and carte de séjour. So just to be clear for everyone, what would happen is that, let's say most of your polls said they were retiring in France. So you're retiring in France, you're coming from the USA, Canada, UK. You get help or you don't get help, but you apply for your visa, you get a 12-month long stay visa. In that context, what happens that is after 10 months, you can apply for your renewal through a carte de séjour, and that can be done in France. This is the advantage of that visa, and that's why you need to make sure you've got this one. So this can be done in France. You don't have to return to whichever country you've come from, and that will then be delivered at the discretion of the préfecture, and that could be delivered for 10 years as a maximum, or for 1 year, if they wanted to. So depending on the profile that you present to them in the similar kind of context that you've initially had to have a profile in the first place, they will deliver that carte de séjour. That carte de séjour doesn't have any language requirements, but does have requirements in due course of somewhere safe to live, income requirement, and of course health. And some prefectures are now saying you need to definitely be on the health system, the French national system at that stage. So this is a new thing that's recently cropped up. And so you only need language requirements and skills if you apply after 5 years for French citizenship. And in that case, there's cultural requirements, courses to go on, and things like that. But honestly, probably not much point for the majority of you guys to do that. Just a carte de séjour, if you had a 10-year one, I mean, you just renew it. It's pretty simple.
Yeah, and either way, by that point, you will have potentially had 5 years in France, so you will have enough time to have picked up the language and have studied by then. So
completely, but it is quite an intense course, and there's there's a civic course as well, and yeah, one would have to really consider if that's something that they definitely want to do.
Okay, great. Right, well, we'll leave it there with the questions for now for Richard, but we will come back to Richard again at the end. So if you do still have questions for him, you can put them in the Q&A box. And thank you, Richard. We're now going to go over to Fabien and take a look at the health insurance requirements for your French visa application. So I'd like to just ask Fabien, first of all, to just introduce himself and tell us a little bit about Fab French Insurance and what services you provide.
Sure, thanks, Zoe. Yeah, well, we've been around for since basically 2015. Well, we're dedicating to helping the English-speaking community relocate to France in that case, but also other EU countries. I mean, that's at first, obviously, most of the clientele were British, and we're doing stuff like, importing vehicle to France and having to register to insure British registered vehicle and insuring obviously properties, things like that in France. And so we were doing, the top-up health insurance, medical stuff. But since Brexit, I mean, things have changed for the British expats. So we've always have been doing the visa application stuff and, ensuring, providing insurance that's compliant with visa requirements, whatever they come from, but going to France. But since Brexit, obviously, then, well, the British expats has been part of the flock, and now they have to apply like any other EU citizens and go through that process. So, well, that's basically what we've been doing, and hopefully that's what we'll keep on doing for a long period of time. And we've met Richard along the way. I think, as far as I'm concerned, I think it's 2019, 2020, somewhere like around that. And it's been a marvelous partnership ever since, because services are quite complementary. Because obviously, when they want to import a vehicle, there is a vehicle registration, vehicle import, and the insurance bid is often a hurdle. So, we work together hand in hand, and it's been working well for years now.
Brilliant. Thanks, Fab. Okay, let's jump into some questions for Fabien. Start with the basics. Can you explain the health insurance requirements that are needed for a long stay visa application?
Sure, yeah. So, well, first, like Richard mentioned, although the visa centers, they aren't the prefecture, so they're not like a living body on their own, but it's important to understand that, so actually that all of the visas will be subcontracted to a private contractor, which is, for example, the two main sources of expats are the UK and the US in terms of numbers, So in the UK, that subcontractor is TLS, it's VFS in the US for now, because it can be renewed every 5 years or changed. But so the short answer is, well, it depends on where you come from. But in theory, the theoretical requirements is you need to have a policy that meets a minimum, that would cover a minimum amount of medical cares in France. So that minimum amount is 30,000. Although, depending on where you'd be applying for, they can apply different rules. Although, theoretically speaking, it's not something they should be doing. But in London, for example, I don't know, they probably think they're posher in London or whatever. But so the rule there is 100,000 instead of 30,000. So, and these aren't things that are disclosed. These are things that you might discover on the day during the interview. So at the visa center, and obviously it might be a case for rejection. So definitely worth to speak with someone that knows the drill. Otherwise, you might be up for an unpleasant surprise at work, at least, and experience this definitely. So that's also a requirement. The top, by far and large, the top requirement that you should make sure you meet is that you should have a policy that do not have any kind of, so depending on the language, deductible, excess, copay, co-insurance, you name it, whatever the word. Basically, it's something we call in France, you should be insured from the first euro. That's, in France, the French policies usually you have that wording, first euro of premier euro in French. That's basically something you should be looking for. It's very, very important. That's the top requirement. And obviously, there are also policies that would be automatically denied for long-term visas. For example, travel insurance, Schengen plans, hospitalization only policies, and obviously policies with any kind of deductible excesses and all. So yeah, that's basically, the core requirement. You should also make sure you have a repatriation assistance thing on your policy, simply because, well, should the amount exceed, you are in a very critical situation, or it exceeds, or it's about to exceed the maximum coverage you're allowed for, or you want to be treated in your home country, because you're probably, for example, in the UK, you're probably still part of the NHS. So, you could be repatriated to the UK to be treated. So this is also an important part. Make sure you have repatriation on the policy. Public liability is not a mandatory requirement, although sometimes they do check for it. It depends on where you're coming from. For the UK and the US, usually you're fine without it. But again, well, it depends on the context. But that's basically the core things you should take a good look at. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, it is quite specific, the needs for these policies. Do you need private health insurance for a temporary long stay visa or a 6-month visa?
So, well, this one, I would say it's yes and no. So yes, you do need cover. But again, well, it depends on where you're coming from. For once, post-Brexit agreements have been doing great, because they've secured the ability to still use the GIC, which, so the former EIC is no longer suitable. Obviously, it's been replaced by the GIC, and the GIC is acceptable for private medical insurance only in the context of what we call the VLST. So it's less than 6 months. For the VLSTS, it is not acceptable, but it is acceptable for the VLST. So that's a good post-Brexit agreement that's been secured. For any other, expat, coming from the US, Canada, whatever, they do need the insurance as well, same as, with the VLSTS though.
Okay, and is that a similar kind of policy as for the 1-year visa that they're required?
So I would say they're more tolerant with the T,
okay.
But in theory, this is the same requirement. Yeah.
Okay, great. Right, question I get asked all the time, and I can see people are already asking it in the question box now. Do you cover applicants with pre-existing health conditions?
Well, yeah, this one is a good question. I mean, obviously, especially considering the poll you've sent, yeah, many people are considering, moving to a different country. It's often in the context of retirement or pre-retirement. But yeah, well, let's be honest, when you're 50, 60-ish or plus, you probably had something in your life, even if it's minor. So it's not a big deal, medically speaking, I mean. But they do require you have a policy that comes without any kind of medical exclusion. So it's not even a matter of having these covered. It's also a matter of, it is mandatory that you are covered, and if you have medical history or conditions, that they are covered.
Okay.
So then, well, then it gets tricky, because technically speaking, it's impossible to get, it depends on what you have. If you're telling me you have asthma, it's quite easy to get covered. If you're telling me you've had cancer or heart issues or, complex stuff, no insurance company around the world will get you covered. They're private companies, they're here to make profits. Unfortunately, this is, you know, where we're living in. And so until you're part of the French national scheme, it's impossible to get that covered. So how could we meet this? Well, then the loop around is, it's important to understand that visas are a highly political tool. And it's actually something, I mean, Visa and I, we've experienced this a couple of years ago. I mean, in 2021, actually 2 times in a row, in a very short period of time. For example, when, you know, the UK and France were kind of arguing in regard to the stance they should have with the fishermen, you know, on the English Channel. And at that period, we've had quite a few denials for visa applications coming from the UK, because, you know, because of the political situation, kind of made it more difficult. So we've had the same thing with Australian citizens when we had the story with the, you know, the submarines that were cancelled, you know, the order that was cancelled with the French military government, and somehow the British government was also part of the mix. So we've had some difficulties. I mean, it didn't last long, you know, a couple of weeks, couple of months, sometimes it's basically very short. But then we have rejections or denials, and you need to apply again for unknown reasons. And that is part of the reason. So actually, they know it's not possible to meet that expectation. But if everything is good, which is the current state of the world right now, except if you're coming from Russia, unfortunately. But if you're from any country we don't have any, you know, litigation with at the moment, everything is fine. You still need to meet the requirement on paper, though. So, but basically what I mean is they won't dig deeper to see if you're really covered. So basically, if you have a policy that do not disclose whatever it's covered or not, so it's not a lie, it's just, you know, it's not disclosed on the certificate of insurance, it's usually fine. Again, that's why it's very important to go with someone who knows the drill, because otherwise, you know, I mean, they don't know that requirement. If you call an insurance company, whatever it is, their job is not to sell visa applications or to go through visa processes. They probably don't know about that stuff. So what you should be doing is, most of the time we go with policies that have something we call a moratorium, which is basically an automatic exclusion of medical history, which prevents them from going through a medical assessment, which would probably end up with the denial of their application, and also makes the application way faster. And at the end of the day, it's also important to understand that, well, it depends on the country, but in France, should they have something that's excluded on the policy, we don't leave people die on the sidewalk. So basically, they'll be treated anyway. You know, the way the system works is that, you know, if you have to go to the ER, for example, obviously, if you're privately insured, they go through private insurance first. But if private insurance denies the payment, then you can, and obviously, they'll double check, can you pay yourself out of pocket? So if the answer is also yes, then they'll make sure you pay out of pocket. But if the insurance doesn't pay and you cannot pay out of pocket, you'll be covered anyway. You know, it's also the culture of the country, you know. So.
That's very reassuring. And yeah, it seems to be the case across the board that as long as the paperwork that is submitted meets the requirements, it'll pass. But you do need somebody that knows what requirements those are, which is obviously where you two come in. Okay, right. Another question I get asked all the time, might be a little bit tricky to answer, but hopefully you can give us a ballpark at least. What sort of price range is an applicant looking for a suitable one-year policy?
Yeah, well, we all know that the insurance industry is one of the sexiest business on the planet. So yeah, it's like asking how much is a car worth. So it's obviously it's difficult, depends on the age, depends on the type of process and the level of cover you want, blah, blah, blah. Well, basically for the bare minimum cover, you want to get with obviously a visa compliant policy, a long-term visa compliant policy. Well, on average, let's say someone in his early 50s, well, the best seller we usually have is roughly 1,500 per year.
Okay.
1,500. But someone, you know, late 50s, early 60s, probably going to be like, you know, 2,000, 2,200, something like that. Again, considering, you know, the best seller plan, which is usually the cheapest. But yeah, that's the ballpark price range you're looking at.
Great. At least that gives people an idea of sort of what to budget when they're looking at starting the visa application process. Okay. Once I'm resident in France, can I get into the French healthcare system? And does that mean that I'll no longer need my insurance? And if that's the case, follow-up question, if that's the case, can't I just take out insurance to cover me up until I get into the system?
So, well, yes and no. Well, it depends on which part of the question I'm answering, but yes. So actually, I'll answer the last one first because it's important. So it's important to understand that when you show up at the interview, they expect you to be covered for the whole duration of your application. So you're applying for a 1-year visa, you should have a 1-year cover. This is very, very important. So if you come there and say, yeah, I have a 3-month cover, but then after 3 months, I'll be part of the French system, it's an automatic denial. You need to be insured for 1 year. In theory, you also need to have paid for that 1 year. There's also something that's not disclosed on the official website, because when you show up at the interview, you need to show what they call proof of full payment. It's probably translated from French directly, but then you need to have paid everything up front in full, because then they know, the French government know that you've secured something that will cover you for the 1 year, and then you're not a burden on the French state. Obviously, in real life, they do accept if you go with a policy that's compliant with their requirements, and you have a policy that's on installments, they'll be fine with it. Although they would still expect you to show up with a proof of payment. So you need to have paid something, enough proof of that payment before you show up at the interview. This is a very important step because many insurers aren't aware of this, and many insurance companies are not capable of doing that, although they do have compliant plans. So sometimes this is a very critical thing. Sometimes you have to actually have the plan in place before you actually move to France, which basically you're paying for a couple of months for nothing. So yeah, this is a tricky thing. So no, you cannot only apply for 3 months, but some policies will allow you to cancel the plan. Some insurance companies will allow you to cancel the plan if you're, for example, on installments, and let's say 6 months into your expatriation, you're accepting into the French system. So, well, many policies will accept that you can cancel it and then, switch to like a top-up health insurance or something like that. Because it's still not being insured is technically non-compliant as well. Just being on the French system, the bare French system, I would say, it's non-compliant. You need to have French system plus a top-up, then it's compliant, or private medical insurance. But, having nothing but the French system is non-compliant either as well. So when you'll apply at the prefecture, for example, then it would be a rejection too. So, but back to the original question, once I'm a resident, can I get into the French healthcare system? Yes, definitely yes. You need to wait 3 months until you can start the process. This is Richard side of the assistance as well, can help with that. But so you need to wait for 3 months. So the first 3 months, you just go to the beach, whatever, you relax. And once you nicely tucked in into your new home, then you can start. And actually, there are two things that you need to, there is a lot of confusion around that. There are two processes that are, although they are like intertwined, they're not done automatically one with another. It's two separate applications. The first is social security application, which we call the CPAM, so CPAM application. The second one is residency application. These two are linked. You can't, you can't really have one without the other. But for example, if you start application into, for residency, so at the prefecture, and you haven't started with CPAM, at some point you'll get stuck in the process because, it's not automatic. It's not because you're a resident that you'll get covered by CPAM and vice versa. Obviously, alongside the process, at some point they'll ask for, do you have the French social security number? And obviously you don't because you haven't started, but no, that's why they are intertwined. But it's important to make sure you start both ASAP. Obviously there is an order, but it's just to say it's not automatic. Again, Richard can help with both of these things, but these are two processes, not just the one.
Okay.
So you can get into the French system and eventually you will no longer need the private insurance, health insurance. On average, what's the situation? That you do need the insurance for the first year. Most of the time, you're insured for the first year, and from year 2, you can switch to a top-up health insurance. It's just because there is, like Richard say, all these things then will take place in the prefecture, which is vary massively depending on where you're applying, who you're applying with. I mean, well, varies massively, but on average, it's very hard to secure CPAM numbers before 6 months. It's more like 9 to 12 months to secure this.
Yeah, so to get your social security number and get your carte vitale, which is like the healthcare card, that can really be a long process, can't it? I remember mine took ages.
Also very important, a letter from the system saying that you've been accepted, for example. Okay. So it's not enough yet to cancel the policy. You need to have the actual, even if it's a temporary number, some insurance policies can cover you on temporary numbers, but you need to have the permanent numbers, the social security numbers, not just a letter. The difference between permanent and temporary is just that when you are on temporary numbers, you do not have access to that thing we call the teletransmission, which is basically the automatic refund of the claims. So it's just once you're on temporary numbers, you have to manually process any claims, which is fine. It's just manual process and a bit slower. But then once you have the permanent numbers, then everything's automatic, including refunds from the top-up health insurance. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that actually when I moved to France, I had a temporary social security number before they then issued the permanent social security number. So it's a good thing for people to be aware of. And while we're on the subject, is that something that you can also help with people with that top-up insurance if they do choose to stay in France?
Oh, hopefully they will. Yes.
Great.
Yeah,
well, it's for people to know that they can make that transition as well from having that initial policy.
No, of course. And very important to note as well is that unlike the private although technically speaking, this is a private medical insurance as well, the top-up health insurance, actually private insurance doesn't, apart from the visa, but it's for expats, but it's not really a thing in France. If you ask any French citizen about private health insurance, they don't even know about it. It's not something we do in France, because the top-up health insurance, so it's more like a foundation. So, it's what they call an association usually. Most insurance companies, obviously, you have the AXA and Swiss Life and Aviva, which are private companies, but many companies, that's why we call that mutual, because they're more like foundations, and so non-profits.
Building societies.
Yeah.
In the UK, it's like building societies.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, so basically we can help with that. Definitely, it's important to note that unlike the private medical insurance, there is no medical questionnaire with this. I mean, never. I mean, there, even whatever they're private or not private, there is no medical questionnaire. So if the Social Security pays for something, we'll top it up.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Right, next question. Oh yeah. Can British retirees still get an S1 form when moving to France after Brexit? And does this mean that they won't need private health insurance?
This one is definitely the wild card, the out of jail card. Jail is the
I'm giving you all the tough questions today, Fabian.
So no, yes. So it's another of post-Brexit reciprocal agreements that's been, I would say, maintained, because S1 was a thing before Brexit as well. So yes, this is possible. Obviously, there is a bit of an issue because you cannot get the S1 until you are in France. You can apply for it, but you cannot get it until you're in France. But so if you apply for it before you move, you'll receive a letter that says you're accepted, and that is acceptable in the context of a visa application, of a long-term visa application, to meet the requirements in terms of private, instead of the private health insurance. It's also, but it's important to note, you're only eligible, obviously, if you're retired, but also have state pension or national pension. But basically, if you are also a pensioner, it's very important. If you're just retired and waiting for the pension, or do not have full state pension, then if it's just a private pension, for example, it's not suitable. You have to have the state pension.
Okay, that clarifies it. Sorry.
They've also given up on NHS usage. I think that's really important.
Oh yeah,
because for English people that want to go back because they feel more comfortable speaking English to doctors, for instance, if you use the S1, there's no more NHS.
And that, that's actually the reason why we often end up selling a private medical insurance anyway, even if they are eligible, because as Richard say, I mean, there is eligible and applying for it. You know, sometimes they don't really want to apply for it, either because they're not pensioners yet, or they don't want to give away the NHS rights.
That's very interesting, and I didn't know that, so I'm sure there are a lot of people listening who didn't know that either. Okay.
But if you do, then I mean, basically you can switch NHS with CPAM, basically, you know, through the S1, and that makes the private health insurance, I would say, no longer mandatory requirement, because yeah, it's basically you've switched, and the CPAM will then act as if it is.
Yeah, so that's definitely, I think if people are in that position, it'd be a really good idea to talk with Richard or Fab or both, and get some advice on that.
Usually it's probably both, because we kind of, there's one thing that kind of comes with the other. But I think it's a topic that's worth considering is the English language. And whilst the French government's top up, let's say, is 70%, because I think we haven't mentioned this, but essentially for those that are watching that in the USA, this was all really cheap, right? So your coverage for 1,500 euros a year or 2,500 euros a year is usually what it would cost a month in the US, right, for private cover. Wow. So we're still actually, I mean, we have a lot of US clients, and I can tell you that's actually very, very cheap for them. But in general, this is what's even more mind-blowing for US people watching. Once you do enter the French system, you're actually covered for about 70% of, let's say, regular things by the French system. And then that's what we were talking about, the building society mutuelle covers you for the 30% that remains.
Yeah, I think it is a system that a lot of people don't quite understand how it works in France, but yeah, you do have
to be honest, it's very
we don't either, no.
I like to say even French people, I mean, obviously not the ones that are in the business, but even the French natives, they don't understand the French system. I mean, they just go there and they know pretty, I mean, it will be covered pretty much, you know, and they don't just wishful thinking, you know, they're like, yeah, okay, I need to go to the doctor. They don't know they'll pay in advance most of the time. I mean, obviously when they turn like 50, 60 and they're more used to, you know, having gone through quite a lot of.
That's an interesting topic, isn't it? It's worth perhaps mentioning without going too far into it, because it's not a topic of it, but the fact that once you're on the French medical system, or carte vitale, which is what Fabian's just been describing, essentially you pay up front and you then get your money back straight into your account if you're set up digitally. And then the mutuelle will pay the extra bit that the state wouldn't have covered. And that's how it works. It's as simple as that. You just have a card, you go to the doctors, and it's actually, for having somebody that's lived in the US, in the UK, and in France, it's quite a fair system, I think. And medically, you know, I think people that are thinking to move to France from the US, from Canada, from the UK, France, most definitely, and of all of the Latin countries that I've had the chance to live in or be in for periods of time, France is a very safe medical place to live. I think that's really fair to say. It's a really fair and safe place. So the cost of it actually is not really that high.
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, another tough question for Fabian. Can you guarantee that your health insurance policy will be accepted for a visa application?
Well, as we were saying, everyone basically on the panel, this is a political tool, so there is no guarantee. I mean, obviously, since mid-2021, we have, like Richard and his team, we've had 100% success rate in our applications. So, so far, so good. Not even a single denial. But we can, I mean, past applications is not the reflection of what might happen tomorrow. Should anything happens, any kind of political turmoil might happen tomorrow between France and the UK or the US, whatever. So to cope with that, we also have and have had 100% money back guarantee. So basically, when we advise something, we say, okay, you should go along with that policy. Then if it turns out it's denied because of our advice, we have 100% money back guarantee. So that's basically, it makes the whole process safe to go through us. And I think same goes with Richard and his team. So it's also secure. It's worth every penny, because, you know, peace of mind is usually worth a while as well.
Yeah, definitely. Great. I think that's reassuring for people. Right. And finally, another question I get asked all the time. Is there an age limit for retirees to take out private health insurance policy?
Well, this has been an issue because obviously if you're 80 something or plus, very few insurance companies can accept you. Basically, it depends on the age band, obviously. If you are 50 or less, absolutely no problem. By pretty much any company all across the globe actually will be happy to have you on board. Again, perhaps depending on medical history, it's another story, but that's pretty much a rule. Up to 65 then, most will be fine, but sometimes they require you to have like an in-person medical assessment, which, you know, obviously can be a pain because no one likes to have to shop around on the behalf of their insurance company. And then if you are like 75 plus, I mean, 65 to 75, it's almost certain that you'll have to go through something in person, and 75 plus, then it's a nightmare. Obviously, we have a solution. We're insurance brokers, so we have solutions, whatever the situation, whatever the medical history, whatever the age. We do have a limit, though. I hope it's not a real limit because we've never seen it in real life, experienced it. But we can't deal with centurions. If you are 100 or more, unfortunately, we don't have a solution. But up to 99 years old, we do have a plan that could suit the needs. So I would say it's kind of a hard yes. Everyone can be insured, and there is no real limit. If there are centurions listening, I'm sorry, I've excluded you from the group, but not on purpose.
So takeaway from that is you've got to move to France before you reach 99.
Exactly. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Right. I'm going to give you
Food
two.
will be great anyway. So.
Yeah. And put the second of our polls up on the screen, and then we will get through as many of your questions as possible, as many of your live questions as possible, up until the end of the webinar. Right. So the next question up on the screen is, what is your biggest concern about the French visa application process? So number one is selecting the right type of visa. So we talked about many of those different visa types earlier. Having the right healthcare insurance policy. Obviously, that's why we've got Fabienne here today. Meeting the sufficient funds required, which Richard was talking about earlier. Making a mistake on the application form. Or finally, providing the correct paperwork. Oh no, there's more, sorry. Not having a French address. That's obviously something we've covered quite a bit today, and is a pretty crucial requirement, or other. And if you do have another concern, just pop it in the Q&A box or the chat box for us, and we'll...
Might be worth mentioning, because working with Richard and his team, and obviously having dealt with visa since 2015, because before it was for US citizens and Canadians and all, you know, but we've seen quite a lot of applications. And these are the two main reasons for rejection, which is usually on direct ad rejection. You know, usually it's just, you know, they ask you to schedule another appointment. It's also important to understand when you're denied, it's very rare to be like denied straight away. It's usually like, you know, they propose another meeting, or they say, oh, this bit of documentation is missing, or it's non-compliant. But basically the two main reasons for a non-acceptance like straight away is the proof of income,
right,
bit that we've mentioned, and obviously the insurance bit.
Okay.
So these are the two main topics, the source of concern that you should have, you know, in theory.
That's really, really good advice. Right, I'm going to put the results for you up on the screen there. So kind of goes hand in hand with what you were saying. Most people are most concerned about having the right healthcare insurance policy, which is good. You're in the right place for that. Closely followed by selecting the right type of visa. Obviously, Richard's your man for helping you out with that, and providing the correct paperwork. And then, yeah, many other little concerns along the way as well. Great. Okay. Well, thank you to everybody who took part in that. I'll stop sharing those results. And right, we're going to use we've got about 50 minutes left. So I'm going to try and put as many questions as possible for the two of you. I've got a lot of them here. So let's have a look. Start with one for Richard. What visa do we need if we buy a property and rent it out short-term on Airbnb or similar?
Well, again, I need more info because depending on the type of rental that you're going to be providing, there are several sections that you might not need to tick, or you might need to tick. So I'll just try and do a brief summary. If you're planning on renting a part of your house which has got a private access, so it's not your main door, you don't go through your front door to go into the bedroom, and you're not going to be providing breakfast, you can actually go through something that's called loueur meublé non professionnel, and it has to be a registration that a French accountant can do, and it's essentially a passive income of a secondary home or an apartment or something like that classification. Up to 33,000 euros a year, that's fine. If you actually want to be a B&B, so a bed and breakfast traditionally, then there's loads of steps that you need to take. So first, your visa is probably going to not, unless, that's what I was saying initially, unless you're going to be opening tomorrow, you probably can get away with coming on a long stay visa, which is a lot easier, a lot cheaper, a lot quicker to apply for. And then after 10 months, change your status, build your business, make sure you've got the right advice with the right accountant. Don't jump on all the forums and create what we call an auto-entrepreneur, micro-entrepreneur business where you won't be able to deduct any funds, etc. So probably it's probably, for that answer, actually fine to go with a long stay and change your context after 10 months. But if you were going to buy a hotel or run something that's already existing, then you need a working visa, or potentially a talent passport if you meet certain criteria. But okay, on average, most of you guys looking to do this, I guess you're probably renovating a house. It's going to take a little while, and you've got a little bit of time ahead of you. So probably a long stay and then change of situation.
Okay, great. Yeah, that gives a few different options there. Okay, one for Fabienne. I have a medical exemption as I'm on lifelong medication and do not pay for prescriptions in the UK. How does this kind of thing work in France?
Okay, well, it's a two-stage answer. So first, you'll be applying for the long-term visa, for example. So you need to secure a policy that can get you on board, after you accept it. So this is easy to cover, but it's important to understand that these prescriptions will then be automatically excluded. Probably, that's probably what will end up anyway. So what our customers usually do is that they come to France with the policy that exclude this, and it often takes something like 6 to 9 months for them to get into the French system. And during that period, they just do round trips, because you're not in jail, you're not locked up in France for that period. So they just do round trips in the UK, until they're part of the French system, so that they can do the same in France. And they just pile up on prescriptions or drugs or whatever in the UK. And usually they have to do like round trips once per quarter. That's usually what they do. And then once a part of the French system, it depends on the affection or the disease or the drugs. But most of the time, there is a specific status for this in France. It's called the ALD, which is basically long-term disease or long-term affection. And everything that's in regard to that affection will then be covered 100% by the French state, whatever you have top-up health insurance or not. And actually, when you go to the doctor, or let's say the GP, and he prescribes the drugs, so it works exactly like in the UK, same process, just that they know you are on ALD status, and therefore they'll prescribe things that they know will not cost you a dime. So it's kind of the same, but it's a two-step process. The first one is, once you're not part of the French system, and once you're part of the French system, and obviously the process will work differently. But basically, this is the story.
Okay, great. That's really good advice. Right, Richard.
Sure.
Is it possible to eventually apply to become a French citizen after you've had a long stay visa for a certain number of years?
So again, just to clarify, you start with a long stay visa, always, whatever the case, you start with a long stay visa. You then apply for a carte de séjour.
1 year.
Carte de séjour is well, it depends. It could be delivered for 10 years, like for instance, for all the people that were there post-Brexit, they usually got delivered with a 10-year carte de séjour. It's important to mention that this system, the carte de séjour, is ages old. Like, it's not new. It's something that's existed for a very long time. My parents, when they first moved to France 38 years ago, had carte de séjour. That's how the old system worked, and we've basically gone back to it. So the carte de séjour actually could work for the rest of your life in France if you wanted to, because whilst you probably need our help again in the context of reapplication, and most definitely if you want to change your status from non-working to working, by the way, then essentially you're going to have this longest stay carte de séjour. It could be 12 months. Sometimes they're only delivering, but if you have a letter from your mayor, if you're on the tax roll system, if you've got everything that's going to show the French prefecture that you're here for good, they've got a higher chance of giving you a longer carte de séjour. But that's down to their discretion. Worst case scenario, they give you another 12 months to reapply. They'll probably then give you for a longer period of time. So you could stay there for the end of term. But yes, indeed, if you really wanted to put yourself through it and apply for citizenship, and then after a certain period, so after then 15 years, you could apply for nationality if you really wanted to. But these are rules, and I've seen a few in the questions where I've got French parents, etc. It's not easy to actually get French nationality, and you've got to consider or nationality or citizenship. And you've got to consider in the first instance, what's the quickest and easiest way and less stress-free? You know, what's the one that's going to be the easiest for me to apply? Usually long stay visa and then modification of status again. So carte de séjour usually will do 99% of my clients. They'll probably remain on the carte de séjour for the rest of their duration in France. But to answer the question precisely, yes, after 5 years, citizenship is possible. It's a lot of hoops to go through, and even for somebody like myself that was French born, educated, although it doesn't sound like it, I know it's quite weird, but I am actually French, and so it was quite difficult even for me to get that. So yeah, I would probably, for most of your viewers today, a long stay and to a carte de séjour will do you just fine.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's good advice. Right, Fabienne. Gillian's saying, does the health insurance have to be with a French company?
Oh, well, then it gets political again. Well, for example, their policies, Signa, Bupa, which are UK American companies, we've seen quite a lot of rejections with these policies. Most of the time, it's because they go with a plan that's non-compliant, but sometimes the fact that it's not like French is not necessarily the option. It's more like EU policy. If you're with a company that's based in the EU, it's almost certain that they won't be picky with it because they know, it's like in a safe environment because that's EU regulated. If they see like a British company or an American company or whatever, they might just be a bit more picky and noisy. But at the end of the day, if it's compliant, it will work. So it's not mandatory. But still, again, it probably will make your life better. So obviously, we tend to advise. I mean, we're working with American companies and British insurance companies, but most of the time for French applications, we tend to go with French or at least a European policy, which is safer. And just thinking about this, it was mentioning because the titre de séjour or carte de séjour, that thing is like a buzzword in the expat word for France. It's important to understand, as Richard was saying, you always need to start with the visa first. And actually, it's the long-term visa in France is called the VLS-TS, and TS stands for titre de séjour. It's actually a visa that stands as a titre de séjour for the first year, and then you can extend it to become like a permanent, like a fully autonomous titre de séjour. But it's important because the visa is actually also valid should you want to go, in Spain, Portugal, other countries. It's part of the EU. You have an EU visa.
Right. So actually that first year allows you to do that. I didn't actually realize that.
It allows you to travel throughout the Schengen zone.
Okay.
Yeah, well, obviously, as long as you remain within.
But not live in another Schengen.
Yeah, sure.
It's obviously only a visa, like a long stay visa for France, but you can travel.
Yeah, and another thing that just popped, from the back of my mind, because this is something I see very, very often. The only case where I see like a deep struggle is the business visa. And I do advise that anyone that's considering this visa should consider Richard's services, because back to the proof of income bit, if they do not have something, if the income they have is a future income, because this is a business they're setting up and things like that, they'll need to show up at the visa center with a business plan. And, if you do that on your own, you're probably up for trouble. So I would definitely, it's almost mandatory from my perspective to go with an immigration advisor if you're going through that.
Yeah,
You also need the medical insurance, but it's very important for me. Yeah.
And funny that you mentioned the working visa, because I do have a question as well from somebody saying, is 1 year insurance policy also required with a working visa? I'm assuming it is, but is it a policy for a work visa?
Well, actually, the requirements are the same, whatever the visa. It's just that in some cases they do have exemptions. For example, it's not really an exemption, but for example, for the work visa, like Richard mentioned, most of the time, the company that's employing the person will take care of this.
Of course, and then they have to provide you with a French contract and French contracts have to come with private cover, so to speak. So,
right.
But sometimes, I mean, I've had many cases where the company doesn't know, obviously, it's a UK company, and the person will be like a detached worker or work remotely from France. And therefore, they haven't looked into this, and the employee is basically on its own. So the requirement is the same for every person. If they do that before the employee actually moves to France, and the employee then is covered by French social security services, because they've paid on his wages, they've paid the taxes, and also he's part of the French service, then they don't need it because he is part of the CPAM. But if they didn't, they'll need it. So yes.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Right. I'm going to try and we haven't got much time left. I'm going to try and squeeze in a couple more if I can. I've had quite a few saying similar versions of this. How long can you be out of the country with the carte de séjour or a long stay visa? As in out of France, I assume they mean.
Yeah, I mean, I think the important element there in terms of the question is that once you've had that delivered and you've got everything in place, you can go out of the country. In terms of anywhere in the world, you might need a visa to travel to go to that other country, like if we're talking of India or something like that, but there's no imperative limit time there. But it is that you're going to have to, you once you are on the carte de séjour, it's a different status to being on a titre de séjour, which is the 12-month long stay one, and you can actually travel freely as you wish to do so. Obviously, the titre de séjour comes with some imperatives, as we mentioned. 3 months after it being issued, it has to be authenticated by your local prefecture, wherever you said that you were going to be living in France. Otherwise, it becomes invalid. And same thing, after 10 months, you've got to do that. But so if you then left the country for X amount of time, once you've got your carte de séjour, not really a problem.
Yeah, okay. And what about with once you've got a permanent residency card? Because I've had a few people send questions like this in as well, where if they receive permanent residency for France, can they actually spend a short period of time living in another country, for example, live away, I don't know, go back to the UK for a year or something and keep that residency or not?
Yeah.
It's a grey area, I guess. To give you an answer, if one of my very best friends is a barrister, and he always tries to deflect the question. I think in this context, it's quite a new element to consider. Technically speaking, the carte de séjour is as valid as until it's been issued to. So if you've got a 10-year one, you've got a 10-year one.
Right.
There's re-entries that will be stamped, etc. And I guess if you didn't have, and you were tested to not have a house, not have a social security number, not have a bank account, etc., they could remove that. But in the context of it, no, there's nothing stopping you going to another country during a period of time.
It's important because what Richard just said, it's basically if you decide and live to another country, then it's not automatic unless you do something about it. But
Sure.
For example, they won't cancel the social security number, the French social security number. And it's
I think after a number of years they do, Fabien.
They have to know you're no longer around. And for example, there is a case that we see very often. This one is that we have obviously clients, because I mean the French insurance industry works very differently. All policies are automatically renewed from 1 year to another in France, which is very different. They don't expire. It's because we are a bit indisciplined, so the government made it mandatory, and so, in order to make sure that people remain insured. But basically, the policy lapse from one year to another, unless you specifically cancel them. But for example, if you leave France, so you have top up health insurance and you leave France and you say, okay, well, I've left, so please cancel my mutual. So this is a possibility and we'll be able to get it done, don't worry. Most of the time there is that struggle because they need to also prove they're no longer part of France. And the easiest way is to just say, well, my French social security number is no longer valid. You know, I've renounced my rights towards the system because I'm no longer part of the French system and no longer intend to use it. But this is important because then it needs to be done. It needs to, you know, they need to specifically say to the CPAM, we no longer run and please cancel these numbers. So they'll cancel it, but it's not automatic. So as Richard said, eventually they may catch up on the situation and say, okay, well, the numbers will expire or they'll cancel it.
And the can't be told that it's not used. If it can't be told it's not used, eventually it's cancelled. That's why sometimes if I wish it to all of you to never be sick, right? So once you got your company towel, you're not sick, you're not going to the doctors, you're not going to the pharmacy. You'll actually have to pretty much, I think it's quite regular actually, Fabian. This is actually a linked question to it.
Well, there is the card.
Go in the pharmacy and just put your card in, right? You've just got to
the numbers. Yeah, the social security number pretty much never expires unless obviously you have like a certificate when you're part of the system when it says your rights are valid up until, and you have a date. So up until that date, the numbers are valid pretty much forever. I mean, up until that date, and then it needs to be renewed. But the card, indeed, as Richard said, well, it depends. It depends. It's obviously they have a computer system. It's automatic. So if anything changes, for example, you change your mutual or things like that, then the card needs to be updated. So it can be done, you know, at your GP, pharmacy, there are many point of service, medical point of service where it can be updated, but it needs to be done. Otherwise, the card is then outdated and it's not valid. So it doesn't need to be changed, but it needs, you know, you need to fit it into a machine and manually request for an update. Yeah. So usually if you don't do that at least once per year, your card becomes invalid. So it's once per year.
That kind of answers the question. You got to spend a bit of time in France and use your company towel in the farm.
Yeah, well, obviously it's a lot more complicated than it all seems. So that just reinforces the fact that people should get in touch with people like you to get the right advice on things. We're going to wrap things up now because we're running out of time. And I know these two could talk about visas and healthcare all day. We'll have to get them back on again to do that. Right, thank you so much to all of you that attended today, and a big thank you once again to Richard and Fabienne for giving up their time and answering all of your questions. If you do have any additional questions or you want to get in touch with French Connections, HCB or Fab French Insurance, keep a lookout for our follow-up email, which will have the details of how you can do that, and it will also have a little special offer for appointments with both of them. So do make sure you use the link in the email. If you enjoyed today's webinar, keep an eye out for more than hold on, that is all coming in, great. If you enjoyed today's webinar, keep an eye out for more FrenchEntrée webinars over the coming months. We have upcoming webinars that will be focusing on moving to France, on real estate and investments for Americans in France, and also on retiring to France, among many other topics. And we'll be announcing details of those soon. You can sign up for our weekly newsletter over on the FrenchEntrée website to make sure that you stay up to date, and don't forget to subscribe to our FrenchEntrée YouTube channel so that you can watch the replay of today's webinar. And finally, do let us know what you thought of today's webinar, what topics you'd like to see us cover in upcoming webinars. You can drop us an email at webinar@FrenchEntrée.com. Thank you one more time to everyone for attending, and thank you to Richard and Fabienne, and I'll hopefully see you all on the next webinar. Thanks.
Thanks guys, bye-bye. See you in France soon.